What's up, Gromies? Welcome to AROYA Office Hours, episode 131. I'm Cian, joined by your resident cultivation expert, Jason. How's it going?
Doing well. Doing pretty good. How are you?
Doing pretty well myself, although I am just getting tons of rain, and I really wish it would do something else, either sun or snow. But the rain is a little hard to live with this time of year.
Yeah, well, we could have sent some cold down your way. We were -10 last week or last couple days here, so
that's what I kept hearing. Freezing fog.
Yeah, a little bit, and I think today we're up to 25 coming in to the studio here, so it felt pretty good. I think
swinging up towards the warm side. That's good.
Yeah, hell yeah. We got Seth rolling in right now here. He's looking good. We both got our sweatshirts on today, so hey, Seth.
Change. How's it going, man? Oh, we're live already?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, we're rolling.
Of course.
Yeah, we're rolling. How are you doing today, Seth?
Oh, not too bad, dude.
Nice.
Just got lost in Pullman, That's always fun to have to drive through WSU.
Well, let's get rolling. Big shout out to all our live viewers today on YouTube and Instagram. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to smash that like button, tell your friends about Office Hours Live, and leave a review to help our podcast thrive. We super appreciate the exposure and anyone you turn on to us. To start today out, I want to jump into a live question from Vanxiety. So Vanxiety's question is, my overnight dryback EC, he later corrects to substrate EC, is 8 to 9, using a 3.5 input EC, but I've noticed my runoff EC is always around 6.0. What's the theory on this, and does it mean I should increase my input EC? My pH is 5.7.
Yeah, so runoff EC is obviously going to depend on basically 3 direct variables. Obviously, input EC is going to cause some changes in our runoff. Maybe we'll get to the third variable to talk about that. Root zone EC, and then obviously how much runoff are we pushing, right? So let's say our root zone EC is at 8 or 9, and we have very, very little runoff. We would expect that to be closer to 8 or 9. Obviously, as we're filling that pot with more 3.5 EC, it's going to be diluting some of those concentrated salts in that substrate. So, obviously those numbers are really pretty good. I don't think I would make any changes based on the numbers presented. Obviously, like I was saying, more runoff is going to push your runoff EC closer to 3.5 as it mixes with that higher EC in the substrate.
Yeah, I think this brings up why substrate sensing is actually so important, because we're trying to base things off of EC. It is always dependent on actually achieving that runoff, and we're always going to dilute that. And there's a few different ways to do it. If we're getting some leaching on our way up on the P1, we're going to see some interesting runoff readings because we're pushing more of that diluted solution through. However, because we can see what's going on in the root zone, that's what we're actually targeting. That's generally the value we want to follow. The runoff EC is, for that to be accurate, it's going to be highly dependent on you being able to achieve the top of your P1, full saturation, without any leachate occurring on the way up. And that's more or less impossible when distributed across a bigger population of plants. So in this situation, just like Jason said, I wouldn't change anything. I would keep operating off of, your root zone ECs look good. And then following your root zone ECs, just keep a check on your pH. Make sure that in achieving that kind of stack, you haven't necessarily driven the pH down in the media by restricting runoff too much. Yeah, I think everything sounds good. Keep on rocking it. And then probably if you have 24-hour, EC monitoring, you can start to look at that overnight EC spike and see when, like, hey, we've been running that 3.5 to, let's say, stack up above the nutritional needs of the plant. We can look at that EC spike and see if, hey, maybe around week 4, week 5, we drop back from a 3.5 to a 3.0. Save a little money because we're not seeing the plant uptaking quite as much nutrition to build structure.
Yeah, and one of the things you said there is like, the accuracy of things. And sure that, the accuracy of your EC meter in your runoff it's reading what the EC of the runoff is. How that's affecting plant growth really it's just on an inference, right? And so all of us have been trained before we had access to high quality root zone ECs. Hey, let's use that to infer what type of root zone that our plants are encountering. Obviously, once we have root zone EC, that information, it's much more like maybe a luxury or something you really don't even need to consider because you have that root zone EC. As far as runoff pH, that's the one that you really want to be putting the effort in to get.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good comparison here would be trying to diagnose your plant's deficiencies based on only symptoms that you see. In that case, when we're looking at deficiency symptoms, sure, we have known symptoms that are associated with certain deficiencies, certain types of spotting, marginal leaf edge necrosis, pale green growth, yellow growth. Those are all indicative of certain things. But if we look at, like, for instance, the pH variable, if that pH is too low out of range, we're going to see deficiency across all inputs. It's going to happen. So at that point, I mean, the comparison I would make is your runoff is like looking at those symptoms and trying to diagnose it, whereas your substrate sensor is a lot more similar to just getting a tissue analysis and seeing what's actually deficient there. And while that's not a direct comparison, the point is we're looking for the most direct representation of what's actually affecting the plant, and runoff is a highly relative measurement that can be influenced really even by our effort to try to collect that sample, which makes it very difficult to actually gauge on what kind of nutrition the plant is living in, what kind of salinity levels it's living in, and what we're actually providing it and targeting.
Yeah, I think it's one of the questions I get probably most frequently from growers when they're first starting to use our system and they're used to tracking that runoff EC is, why am I seeing this difference? What does this mean? Should I be worried? Shouldn't I be worried? And I think you guys explained that really well. Kind of just to touch on it, the overall concept is that those numbers shouldn't necessarily be equal. They aren't a one-to-one relationship.
Right. And I think in your own journey, Cian, you experienced running for quite some time off of just runoff readings and then being highly surprised at what you're getting out of substrate EC once you actually plug in 24/7 monitoring to that. It's, we're with runoff, if we really nail it, we're getting a very small window, and to do proper testing via relative methods, you're going to go pull samples. It's not really that efficient to go take scoops or cores out of your pots every single day to try to figure out what's going on with the media. If you don't have enough plants, eventually you're just going to reduce your media size trying to sample that and actually do like a lab grade wash test, which is, ultimately highly useful, but the turnaround time and processing time on that type of sampling is not really efficient for the commercial production we're looking at, especially if we can get a much more direct reading in the root zone.
That's a great way to explain that. Well, I want to move us on to another topic that we've had a number of questions on recently. Going to move into the realm of under-canopy lighting, because we just get bunches and bunches of questions on this. I think, because it's an up-and-coming technology, people are excited about it. So this one, have you guys implemented under-canopy lighting? If so, does the place it comes from matter? China, US? What are your opinions?
So most of the large diode manufacturers have consolidated. And so typically it just kind of comes down to what diode is that manufacturer using? What kind of warranty do they come with? What's the price point that you can get them at? So we're just talking about, all right, build quality and, what's the quality of diode and implementation? So where they come from, I'm not sure I know of actually very many under canopy lights that are manufactured anywhere but China right now.
Or LEDs for that matter, China or Korea.
Yeah.
Diodes aren't made in the US or Canada or where most of us live.
So yeah, like I said, what it comes down to is, what's your trusted source of those as that manufacturer? Do you think they're going to be around long enough to supply replacements on your warranty? What's the performance of the actual diode and power supply that they're supplying?
Yeah, I think another important thing to look at is obviously spectrum and then spectrum tunability. So if we're looking at under canopy lights, there's a few different concepts we're looking to implement to improve. So earlier on while we're building structure, if you have under canopy lights that have a lot more blue spectrum, basically that white presentation that a lot of us are used to seeing in LEDs, that's going to drive a lot more vegetative growth early on. Whereas we have, different models on the market from different manufacturers that have slightly different spectrums, some of them leaning much more towards or having tunability towards the far red spectrum. And there's different ways to implement that. If we're looking at early flower, we typically want a more blue spectrum to produce vegetative growth and actually beef up that plant. After we hit a certain point, we're looking to implement more and more of a red and far red spectrum to get better, implement better light. Penetration's the wrong word. We're getting light deeper into the plant, but not by penetrating more from above. We're just providing photons in the right spectrum down in the canopy to really drive ripening. Because, one thing we see with a lot of strains, especially like in today's world of candies, is that spectrum and light exposure have a lot of influence on anthocyanin expression and potency and finish, ripening expression. So by introducing that deeper red light down into the canopy later in flower, we're driving that response. Early in flower with the blue lights, we're actually driving more growth and bud site production. So it's important when you're looking at under canopy lighting to evaluate what your specific goals are, and then also look at like how you're going to achieve those. So for a lot of people that implement under canopy, especially with LED applications or very, high bay HPS applications, what we're looking to do is increase that light and actually beef up yield. And also in those situations where we're dealing with not necessarily the best PPFD from above, part of what we're doing is trying to really beef up that growth. And oftentimes that's accompanied by, let's say you have a 700 watt panel LED, you're not getting good light penetration. One of the first things you're going to do to increase that yield is do less skirting up, because if you've been trying to produce, let's say, A-grade flower under a 700 watt panel LED without good penetration, you've probably been skirting up pretty high and throwing away a lot of your B and C buds because they're not worth anything on the market. They're just contributing to that camo pack look, purple and green, right? And if the intent is to drive better maturation, we're looking at more of the deep red light intensity, far red. If we're looking to beef up growth, we're looking at more of that blue, but it's important to understand when to use those in the cycle, because we do talk to growers who are experimenting with this. We got to see both spectrums. Some of them try to implement a very blue-white LED all the way through, don't necessarily get the ripening results they want, but they're achieving greater biomass. On the flip side, if we go just pushing that hard red later on and not necessarily having the tunability to push growth earlier, we might not get the yield increases we expected, but we can maybe influence the pound price by having a more consistent, or saying, hey, if we get $1,300 a pound for our top purple nugs, usually we're having to separate those middle nugs and get, $600 a pound for those because they're green. Now, hopefully we can take that pack and make it 80% the $1,300 rather than before where we were at 60%. So when looking at under canopy, it's very important to establish, like Jason said, quality. One thing we're looking at is, hey, you put these plants in, you slam your under canopies in, and then you go ahead and spray. Are the lights cleanable? That's a huge thing for me, and something I see a lot of LED growers struggle with that bought LEDs with like exposed diodes and boards and stuff, and now they're limited on how easily and efficiently they can clean their systems. So there's a few factors to look at, and I encourage people to shop around, and when looking for them, don't focus on price point, focus on spectrum and tunability, because you either want a specific purpose, which is ripening, a specific purpose, which is bulking up biomass, or the tunability to do all of it. And, we kind of see representations in the marketplace of all of those options.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting things, I'm going to share the screen here as well. You talked about spectrum. Chris, I don't know if I need to zoom in on that a little bit better if we're good, but most manufacturers of LEDs are either extremely tunable or they have the selectability for under canopy lights that are designed to go in HPS rooms or under canopy lights that are designed to go in LED rooms. And ones that are going in HPS rooms are actually usually a little bit heavier on the blue side. They're typically focused on a little bit lower into the spectrum to kind of not necessarily offset, but to supplement, to fill in some of this blue light that may not be present with your HPSs. And this picture here I'm showing is kind of it's actually a really nice graphic, but it's showing us the wavelength distributions for output light of HPS. Obviously CFL is just in there, but LED and then sunlight, right? So if we think we combined LEDs, some under canopy, which are traditionally these a little bit higher on the blue end, and then these HPSs, we're going to have a more full spectrum presentation on the plant. And what this is important for is activating certain molecules in the plant that are producing things like anthocyanins, phytochromes, those enzymes that are outside of our typical activity in chlorophyll A and B absorption wavelengths. It's one of the reasons that we see really good expression when we are able to balance those out. And some of them are actually responsible for a little bit higher amounts of growth and definitely higher THC percentage and terpene production.
Yeah, that's a good point. Between chlorophyll, beta carotenes, and a few other pigments that we're looking to activate to produce responses in the plants, all of those respond to different wavelengths of light. I think this is a good example. Full sunlight is obviously what these plants have evolved for millions of years to produce in. And by tuning that spectrum, we can focus on different aspects of plant growth, different morphologies. But it's also important to recognize that when you have these spectrum differences with different types of lighting, we're dealing with a lot of the same strains under different situations, and it's important to log and keep track of what kind of expression you're seeing based on that spectrum, and then also balance that with how many changes are you making at a time. So if I was growing under HPS, I switched to name a brand of LED light and then name a brand of under canopy light. I would really want to do a lot of work to make sure that, hey, I'm trying to match the spectrum as best I can for these strains. And then just logging like, hey, what are the differences? Because another thing we'll see is with the incredible genetic variability in cannabis, we've got some guys that run strains that have been selected for HPS under let's say 12 generations. They go to LED. We're getting a different expression, and that's because they've so hard selected for that spectrum, oftentimes not on purpose. And we just see a different expression under most LED spectrums. And unless we can match the spectrum that plant's been tuned for, we're not going to get quite the same output. And really that just goes back to crop registration, logging the results of what you see, and then making choices in your business about what is most important to your customers, because we'll always go back to that, we stare at plants every day. It hurts to see a sick plant. It hurts to see something that looks rough. But, the difference between having, let's say, 100 plants and 10,000 is the ability to look at some ugly plants and go, hey, that's going to happen. I only have so much control here. And then extend that to, there are certainly plants that I've grown that, I'll be honest, in the last week look like absolute garbage. But they're giving me some of the highest THC, some of the highest yields, and some of the best terp profiles. So it's important to look at your end results as well when considering all of this. It's exciting for us growers to get a new toy, throw it in the garden, and be like, man, my plants look great, or they look terrible. But ultimately, the end product is what we're really going for, right? So that's one thing I've talked to a lot of growers about is like, hey, some strains we are forcing into senescence through ripening conditions and irrigation. Other ones, and if you've had the luxury of growing, let's say, 60 different strains, you'll find that some of them, if you grew that strain 60 times and tried it 60 different ways, 45 of the ways it's going to be about the same, because that plant is so determinate in its growth habit that as long as it has enough light, enough water, and enough nutrition, it's going to hit a good yield number. But then we'll hit other plants that, if we're not tracking all the variables going in, are going to hit a lower yield and quality number. And that's really the important thing to dial in on. And then also, moving forward with your business, expect that, like, hey, we're still a long ways from having stable genetics that are great for growers. Right now it's one thing I think is really cool about the cannabis industry is generally we're still selecting for nose quality, consumer satisfaction at the end. As growers, we'll do a pheno hunt and, always kind of try to run that balance. Like, hey, we popped 20 seeds. One of these, the best nose we all agreed was like a semi-dwarf. Okay, we're not going to take that one because we can't get it to yield. But then the next thing is, hey, okay, we've got these other 8 phenos. We've got a range of terpene expressions. We got a range of THC expressions and a range of yields. And we're always looking for kind of that nice balance of yield and quality. But ultimately, as the market saturates and starts to condense, we all know that quality is becoming more and more of an upfront issue. So it's forcing growers to basically up their game and improve their facilities to be able to grow some of these genetics that don't respond easily to general cultivation practices, and that require a little more finesse and attention to get that competitive result out of. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on if you like challenges or hate them, that's going to be the state of the cannabis market for a while, because there's not a great correlation between the genetics that consumers want to buy, that jar they crack and it blows up the whole room, and again, the strains that are easy for growers to grow and produce on a regular basis. And, for me, that's one of the things that keeps this industry interesting. The fact that we don't have genetics that are so tuned to these commercial production systems that we can just hit play on 5 different factors and let it run. We've actually got to fine tune our system. And then when we do fine tune that top, it might just be a few small adjustments between 2 strains in terms of irrigation strategy and environment. But those tiny adjustments, a couple degrees here and there, a little higher EC, a little lower EC at different times, especially riding out towards the end or at the very beginning in the first 3 weeks, we can see some pretty large differences. I know one strain that is a notorious heavy feeder that I've been putting a lot lately is Cap Junkie. In just EC differences and nothing else in terms of irrigation strategy, oftentimes I see a 15 to 25 gram difference in weight run to run, just because we were able to keep EC at a certain point in the run and not flush it out. Okay, is there some science behind that? Sure. But one beautiful thing about this cyclical production system is you have every run is a chance. I don't want to say a chance to experiment. Don't go wild. But it's a chance to gather data and learn from it. The more you can collect, the more you can understand about that run. And then if you can replicate that to the best of your ability with minimal variables, you're going to start to tease out some of the differences in these strains. And, we always talk about this. Unfortunately, there's not good information in cannabis the same way that there is in other crops about what exactly different strains like. Right now we have so many producers out there that are growing intuitively and honestly doing a great job, but communicating what you're doing if you don't have enough tools to measure it to another person is incredibly difficult. And in agriculture, you can, controlled ag especially, you might have the golden ticket on your environment and irrigation, but if you can't define it, you can't replicate it. And I think that's where a lot of people really struggle. I don't want to say it's easy to set up a 10 lighter and have great success, but it's going to be easier to set up a 10 lighter and have good success compared to a 1,000 lighter on that scale. So the calculations are a lot easier. You're dealing with less dynamics in your system. Be prepared for that as you scale up, and really understand the difference between gardening and farming and try to decide what you're going to focus on, because those are two different things. And while there is crossover, one is more intuitive and passion driven. The other one is, hey, we're putting numbers on this so we can repeat that process and form a sustainable business on it.
Yeah, I think for me, it's one of the reasons that I enjoyed building out the AROYA product as much as I have over the years. And that is just to really give people a robust place to do crop registration, to do crop journaling, to try and tie results, photographic evidence, sensor data all into one spot. That's a little bit easier for them to keep organized, store, share, and make comparisons to help them make those small tweaks as they're experimenting.
Yeah. Well, and using technology to capture it, because like I tell clients all the time, rewind life 10, 12 years. And I had a job that was just to take this data in spreadsheet format, build graphs at the end of a growing season and present it to people. Okay. 10, 12 years ago, that took a person to do all that. Now you can get some technology to keep logging it for you and not have to necessarily dedicate a huge portion of your company's budget to just data collection. And when we expand that to greater ag, if I'm a wheat farmer, a barley farmer, garbanzo bean, rotational crops around where we live, I'm not taking any of my land hardly unless someone pays me to do research. I'm looking at available resources, using soil testing, and making sure I nail that. And then if I happen to work with an agronomist that does things, they're going to go do all that sampling and then look at my end results and try to draw correlations. We're not talking, and in cannabis, it's the same thing. We can't necessarily take a whole lot of space and dedicate it to research. This is a farm, and although we have the highest profit mark, well, depends on who you are, but the highest sale price of any crop per gram or pound. If you want to run your business at 100%, you've got to find a way to harvest data off of your ongoing production system without taking chances that are going to push you backwards. And you need technology to do it. There's just no cost-effective way to do it without that. If we look at greater ag, we're talking thousands of production acres to one research acre. Okay, translate that to your 9-room facility. If you have one room that's R&D, that's a huge proportion of your farm that you're taking a chance on. And while it may seem cool in the beginning, fast forward a few years, pay a bunch of bills, and those are not going to sound like great chances to take on a regular basis. I can definitely tell you that.
I think this is definitely one of those conversations that we can expand on in a lot of ways, just in terms of how prevalent it is right now for people to be talking about, what are the effects of potential changes that can be making to my grow? Under canopy lights is one of the biggest ones we hear time and time again. I've got a bunch of questions that have come in just during this conversation about things as ranging from like, what's a good way to clean the LED diodes? A couple of answers from people in the comments as well, saying they prefer to use, looks like 99% rubbing alcohol to be able to go through and clean those guys off, which, great suggestion there, and brings up, just that point you were making about how important it is to have serviceable and cleanable equipment. We also had another question from North Fork Farms that was dealing with pretty much the same thing that you expanded on, Seth, which is, what is the role that light plays when it comes to anthocyanin production, and noticing how over time he's seeing that the branches, especially a lot of these candy gas strains that he is growing, are responding more to light exposure in their anthocyanin production versus just the environmental changes that he's instituting. And you did a great job of, talking about how you will have a lot of these factors that play into what affects your plant morphology. And Jason, just to back up what you said, having these robust tools to analyze and register all of your data points about your crop gives you the ability to go back through and understand which of those factors is contributing to that anthracene in production. I know a lot of people out there are looking to increase that, and kind of like Seth said, get away from the camo bag look so that they're able to increase that sale price. And one of the best ways to do that that people seem to be finding is to, like you were saying, Seth, kind of look at how to even out that photon distribution further down in the canopy so that more of those green buds turn into finished mature purple buds.
You just log it. I mean, I got a great example. I was talking to a girl the other day that was playing with I'll name drop here, Faven, one of my favorite under canopy lights. They're very tunable spectrum. He was running complete far red starting at like day 18. He's like, all of my stems turned purple in like less than a week. I was like, okay, maybe don't do that, but I think one good thing to do is research it as much as possible and kind of learn some of the already existing science about, different wavelengths and what kind of plant expression they affect, because that's all readily available out there. We know that having a little more far red compared to more blue, just the classic white LED versus HPS, right? We can get a little better spectrum expression out of having more red and yellow in the spectrum. Look at that and really take that into account when you're doing these, and then understand that like that example I gave, that's a small difference. That's like one switch, like let me twist the dial. And if I did the wrong twist at the wrong day, that gave me an expression I want. Or on the other hand, does that matter? If red light made the stems express purple or red, is, a lot of times we'd associate that with a particular deficiency, but that's not always the case. I've grown strains that'll give me red stems no matter what the hell I do, and they still end up yielding and testing just fine. So it's also important to take those notes and establish, like, are we dealing with I think that's one thing that gets skipped over, and especially people who have gotten more into commercial cannabis growing recently. Just look back at some of the historical genetics that were on sale. If you go back like 10 years, certain traits like duckfoot leaves was a funny one that came on, saw blade leaves. Like there's some different weird genetic expressions that can happen that are way outside of what we normally see. And with the prevalence of, I'll say, pollen chucking, just untracked breeding basically going on, who knows what the heck you're going to run into. I've seen some really interesting expressions out of stuff where like, wait, you crossed this with that and you got this lumpy, like saw-bladed weird plant out of it. They're like, yeah, I don't know. You're like, well, it is what it is. Let's track it and see what it can do. And who cares if it's got skinny saw blade leaves if it yields 3.2 pounds of light and has 32% THC, right? Like that might bother you, but get over it.
It's been a while since I've looked at a lot of mutations. But man, some of the funniest ones were, I hear you, polyploid mutations when we would see the cola like stretch out, like rather than being apical dominant cola, it would be like kind of splitting by itself.
Yeah, share that one. It's like an oval, if you look from the top, like an oval shape, not a round shape bud. Another one I've seen that used to drive me nuts is corkscrew shaped pistils, really hard curled in pistils, rolled leaves. And again, cyclically, as long as a plant is performing at an economic level, you have a fun chance to evaluate some of these things and see if they're actually plant responses, or is that just a weird plant? Because, people have spent the last, at least in the US, the last 50, 60 years collecting weird genetics from all over the world. And I can say as a plant nerd, the weirdest, most interesting looking stuff is the stuff that catches my eye and I want to keep, for better or worse. Sometimes,
Yeah, the hard part there is it's also a lot of times the least commercially viable stuff to be working with. So it's like, we like the exotics, but how much of it can we grow? All these topics bring up kind of really good point as to how do we make improvements without taking large risks? right? And Seth and I are both in really good positions to think about that. Obviously, come from very different backgrounds as far as education and experience go.
We both grew a lot of dope.
Well, yeah, yeah. But before that, and while we're doing it, kind of different perspectives. But it really what it comes down to is let's combine, proven science with some experience, and make those tweaks based on, hypothesis, right? And when we brought up that experimentation thing, it's not like, let's just throw ice in our fertigation tank and see what happens. Like it's going down to that next step and we say, okay, well, if I do this, what type of parameter impact does it have on the plant itself? Well, now let's do some research on, how does that parameter affect plant growth? Make a hypothesis and say, sure, if I turn on my red spectrum a little bit earlier in the cycle with those plants, am I going to anticipate slightly more anthocyanin in production? And then evaluate it, obviously. And as we said, crop registration and tying it into one place to document that is really kind of the only way that at scale you can start to track and implement what changes have made that outcome. It's kind of funny when we talk about in AROYA, we've got these recipes, these grow templates that I usually basically help people build out a generic one. And then as they start possibly implementing that with a few strains, or maybe they already have some ideas of what certain strains that they're growing kind of like, as far as how long are we running a generative stacking, what should we set our thresholds for EC levels at, light levels, when we need to change that stuff up. And really the best of those growers are they're making duplications, and then they're also changing some of those variables and building out basically a library of genetic templates on how they want these plants to be grown. And every once in a while we get one that someone makes a mistake or a piece of equipment has an issue, and they get to go back and look at, wow, we didn't even catch this during the growth cycle, but we had either phenomenal yield or extremely good chemotype come out of there. And they have that resource to go back and say, hey, let's update our recipe to something we may not even done on purpose, but by tying it together with our outcomes, we know this was an improvement. So it's limiting the number of variables so that you can be sure that when we improve it, we change that variable again, we have an anticipated outcome.
Yeah, I think the hardest part, honestly, guys, is like if I was to draw a timeline here, flip, harvest. What Jason's talking about, these fluctuations that happen, and this is the hardest part for growers, that might happen here. That might happen here. That might happen here. But you can't judge anything until past here, when you've got yield results, quality results, and you know what the final product looks like. And that's probably one of the hardest things, is if this happened, let's say an irrigation failure, we had a dehu failure for like a week, high humidity during bulking, let's say, any number of things can go wrong. As a grower, the important thing is to look at it and go, okay, where am I at in this crop? Did this mean total disaster and plant death? And if not, okay, we corrected on this day. We need to finish the program and not think that like, hey, I need to change a bunch of variables here because this happened, because that's simply not true. We need to get back on the program, continue it out the way we would, provided we can get all of our parameters back in range for plant health, and then evaluate from there. And I think that's the hardest thing. I talk to a lot of growers that go like, oh, hey, should I raise light intensity, lower light intensity, change CO2? Like, we start throwing too many variables at it after we've, acknowledged this one variable that's like, hey, let's correct, and then finish it out and try to evaluate that experiment. If we start adjusting CO2 levels here, and then light levels here, and do things, if we introduce 5 different variables compared to how we normally run, it's going to be really hard to parse that data apart and actually decide what made the difference. And a lot of times if we made all these changes, well, if your dehu went down in bulking and we couldn't get the VPD of above a 1.0, we didn't get water pumping through the plants. We're not going to see as much growth. Don't stress about the fact that happened. Get everything back in line and keep on trucking and go, okay, let's not have that mistake. Let's start talking about equipment maintenance intervals and trying to make sure we have proactive maintenance that prevents us from breaking down mid-run. Whereas, some other times we might see a happy accident. What I've seen is on certain strains, like, hey, our AC broke, or humidification broke, and this one strain that we struggle with herming out didn't this time. Okay, cool. Happy accident. What was the yield like on that one? Half to 2/3 of what it normally does when it herms. Okay, well, I don't care if you paid 10 grand for that cut. Sounds like a junk strain if you can't run it in a way that makes your other plants happy and still get an acceptable yield. Or right back to, I remember popping some phenos or doing some seed hunts and finding some semi-dwarfs and things like that had like literally the best nose expression. I mean, I went through this with my last pheno hunt. There's one that is never going to be released because, man, if you can get more than 1.8 pounds of light out of it, good for you. Just slow growing and terrible. And like, dude, that happens. The tracking on all this stuff is not perfect. And also because of the variability, I mean, cannabis, it's not an obligate outbreeder like apples, for instance, but we see a similar level of genetic variability where if you take an apple and sprout the seeds from that apple, you could have a Granny Smith and it could turn out to be more like a sour green crab apple that grows out of it. And that's, we don't always see a direct correlation between parents and seed offspring. And it's important to remember that because, if you've been in cannabis long enough and the term bag seed is relevant to you, there's a lot of those out there. And if you've been growing those, they pop out quite different. And just remember that, like, you might think something is special because you've put a lot of effort into it, but those two things are not always equatable.
Yeah, that kind of leads back into, what you were talking about as far as certain genetics being optimized, if you will, under specific breeding conditions. And I thought, well, it'd be really cool if a breeder had 2 rooms and they were breeding, under LEDs and under HPSs. Almost never would they be selecting that exact, the phenotype from those rooms. We're going to see distinctly different morphology, and the plant responses there are going to give us, a very different choice of phenotype based on responses from a different environmental impact.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Absolutely. Well, I love this conversation because we've had a couple of other questions that popped in here. This one that I wanted to throw past you guys because it deals directly with what we were talking about in terms of, what factor is causing this particular, let's say it's either an uptick or a negative in my crop and how that works. And the question that Finlay asks is, so, hey guys, I love the show. I look forward to it every week. I noticed that when I get a notification to change out my CO2 bottle, the room will drop down to, say, 150 to 200 ppm before I can get it to change or before I can get the new bottle in. What I've noticed is that the plants prey super hard when the CO2 is that low. I always keep my CO2 levels 100 to 200 ppm higher than the PPFD levels. The plants look happy, but not like when I drop the CO2 that low. Do you guys have any idea why, or is this just a correlation?
It's very likely due to impacts of CO2 on water use efficiency and still model response. So, I kind of brought some of this stuff up a few episodes ago. Oh, Seth's going to draw a nicer one than I drew.
I didn't realize you drew that already. I was gotten there.
No, you're good. Mine was red and resembled other things. So yeah, when we think about what's going on in the gas exchange at the leaf surface, those stomates are opening up and they're allowing for, exchange of CO2 into the plant, right? When obviously we think about photosynthetic process, when we think about, what are the molecules that are building this plant, carbon is extremely significant one. It takes up, the greatest portion of the plant mass of any chemical element in its growth. And so when we have a lower concentration of CO2, the plant actually has to exchange more air, more gases in order to get its carbon requirements, right? And so when we see and we've got some guard cells in here as well. Those guard cells are allowing that stomate to be as open as possible when that CO2 is dropping.
Not necessarily as open as possible, optimal. So like when you have the correct amount of CO2, your guard cells have great turgor pressure and they're holding a perfect aperture shape and transpirational shape that balances the amount of transpiration we're getting out of the plant to optimize. Oh, thank you, sir. To optimize the actual use of that water coming in. When the CO2 is too low, we actually see a bigger stomatal opening that's pushing. Sorry, not here. Here. Basically, that's pulling more water up and allowing it to escape without the plant actually utilizing it. And when we have the correct CO2 range, it's going to keep that stomata more reliably open at the right shape to regulate that airflow in the right range that we're getting. Perfect plant cooling, perfect photosynthesis. Here, I'll try to shut up more. And really stability on that throughout the day. So that's kind of a funny thing. If you've got CO2 monitoring, you'll definitely notice like, hey, when you drop down to 100, 150, your transpiration actually goes up, especially overnight. And my best advice would be to start taking notes on how often that happens and try to calculate your CO2 usage. So I would rather give a bottle back and trade it in with 10% left in it than run out for a few days. Personally,
yeah, or have a spare bottle just so you're not in that emergency to get her wrapped up. There's some awesome articles. One of my favorite resources for learning about scientifically proven and studied relationships like this, and that's water use efficiency is what I'd be looking up. Frontiers In is a really good journal site that you can learn a ton from. If you're not a nerd now, read a few of those documents and you will be afterwards.
Yeah, there's a lot of little stimulus inputs, CO2 being one of them, that affect plant growth. And if, we always talk about a holistic approach. If holistically across the board, you don't keep everything in range, the problems that result are going to be hard to predict, but predictable if you mess up the same way every time. And it's important to make sure all those, and that's one of the rabbit holes that I think we talk to a lot of people that go down with either plant nutrition or plant morphology responses is, hey, I've been trying this, that, and that. And then it's like, okay, well, you can't get above 2 pounds of light. A month later, oh, your PPFD is pinned at 600, dude. Like, unless you have every factor influencing your plant growth in line, we can't expect optimal performance. And also without enough data, can't predict how well or poorly a particular strain will respond to that environment with its compromises. I've certainly, like, just the other day I was talking to a customer who had a plant we're looking like, man, this thing, it's just not getting the drybacks we're used to in a slab. Like, hey, man, we're 12 to 15% is the biggest we're hitting at the end of generative. And it's like, it's great. He's so concerned about this. Like, hey, this is a sign of poor plant health, right? And I'm like, okay, well, you ran it through. How'd this last run go? Oh, it threw down like 3.2 to 3.5 light. I'm like, well, damn, that's an efficient plant, dude. It didn't need nearly as much water. It was a heavy feeder, but like, hey, that's an easy trade-off. We can bump it up to 3.5. And wow, you found a real special plant. And the truth is there's thousands, millions of those special plants out there. We've just also, once we can isolate all those variables and decide whether it's our inputs or the plant that's causing this result, then we can make a solid decision. I personally have thrown away a lot of strains that I absolutely loved because they just, the commercial viability wasn't there, like in my opinion, they hit all the marks for me, but it won't turn purple.
You've heard me say it several times where some of my favorites that I've grown over the years, just aren't the ones that brokers were really wanting to, take to market. And it's because they didn't check some of the boxes for them, whether that happened to be, a specific terpene profile composition, or whether that was shape of the nugs, color quality, consistency, whatever that happened to be. Even though it checked all the boxes for me and was maybe one of my favorites to grow, whether it was a large yielder or whether it looked really good, whatever quality that I was attracted to ultimately didn't matter. But it also kind of leads to talk about the fact that how important crop registration is when you're growing these things, because you don't necessarily know for sure how these things went until you get all the numbers back at the end and are able to analyze, what did I do and what did this get me? And this topic about CO2 that Finlay gives us is a really good one, because, without looking at your crop registration and then being able to understand that you're having this CO2 issue periodically throughout the run, praying plants traditionally to most people is a sign of a healthy plant that people are like, yes, this is what I want to happen. However, this may be one of those scenarios where growing that out to the very end, are you seeing the same type of a yield that you would be off of that plant had you been supplying it with the amount of CO2 that it needs during those moments where it was, running short? And if you're not participating heavily in your crop registration, it's going to be hard for you to identify, what it is that might have caused this to work the way that it did. And you may be mistaking that praying plant for a result that's going to net you higher yield or higher quality, when in fact it might not.
Yeah, I mean, the way I like to describe praying plants is kind of no matter what religion you're a part of, prayer in the morning is important. 2 hours later, unless you're a monk or something, it's less important. So that praying is like that's a sign that we're hitting a high turgidity, low water kind of stress point, and that is a healthy sign. But as you said, that's not something we want to see all day, right? And so it's important to also not focus in on one little factor that's giving you an indicator, because whether you've got substrate or climate data, you can still read those responses on the plant. And it's just important to identify what is actually important. You can tweak some small things like CO2 and see some strange responses in that, but they may not actually be good, and it's hard to, you can't determine it that day. It's only a month past harvest when we sit down and look at the final result that we can say, hey, maybe that's good, or wow, we had a run where they prayed in the morning and relaxed by 3 hours after lights on, after we gave them a good amount of water, and that was a better run than when they were just like spraying or praying all the time. And I know I've seen that, Jason, you have in the summer in the greenhouse around here. You're like, these things they're rocking. And then you look at your yields and you're like, what happened, man? Yeah. They look so excited for the last 2 months.
Yep. And that's one of the things, right? If you're not taking notes on all of these little factors, it's easy to go by the I don't know what to call it exactly, the colloquial knowledge, the Grobro knowledge of it's praying, it's doing good, that's going to be fine. But it's not the only factor to consider. And without taking all these notes and having something to compare to and look back to, it's going to be difficult for people to parse out, what happened here and why did this one not yield the way that I wanted it to, even though it was showing all the signs that checked the boxes for me. And then, to kind of touch back on that topic of genetic variability in cannabis, that's another aspect that, heavily document that in your notes, where you got things from, what the respective crosses are, what your known documented history with this plant is, and that will help you long term down the road understand some of the changes that you've seen happen in your plants, as well as some of the results that you get out of the different cultivars you grow.
Yeah, and don't mix up your cuts. Labeling is really important. just calling out a few people that send cuts from the West Coast to the East Coast. No names needed.
Oh, I mean, not even just cuts, but wires, irrigation wires. Please label your irrigation wires. I can't be clear enough about that.
Yeah, it really sucks to like have to call up a buddy and be like, can you go stand in the room while I turn this off and on and see if the one that's supposed to clicks. It's a defeating feeling when you're like, oh, I could have labeled that.
Or if something happens, I mean, there's been times where I've had to go through and replace solenoids on the fly really quickly before a feeding happens. And if you don't have clear labels on things, you might be searching around trying to figure out what wire you're going for a few seconds before you actually land on the right one. And, I've seen people have to do major resets and things like that on all sorts of different equipment. And whether you're dealing with low voltage irrigation wiring or whether you're dealing with, all sorts of different runs of Ethernet cable, please label it. This is one of those industries where it is just wildly important to be good at labeling.
Breakers. Yeah. Label your breakers.
I was going to say, you're dealing with a lot of electronic equipment. Don't be scared of a brand called Fluke when it comes to multimeters, and buying one that can monitor current flow as well as do resistance metering. Again, for better or worse, if you're not already there, you're going to learn to diagnose electrical systems and components. And if you don't want to learn that, you're always going to be chasing your tail. If you learn it just this much and invest a tiny bit in having a decent multimeter, you can stay way ahead of the curve on your equipment breakdowns.
And if you're going to pour some concrete, don't be afraid of like getting a little bit extra sized conduit for the next run, and yes. leave a rope in there, your pull string, so that later on when you're like, ooh, we need another line or we need another wire or whatever, you can get it into that facility, greenhouse, whatever.
Yeah, if your contractor tells you 1/2-inch conduit's going to save you 20%. Trust me, you need the 3/4 or the 1-inch later down the road. It'll be worth your time compared to having them run another piece of 1/2-inch conduit a couple hundred feet.
Honestly, it's a fun topic that we should probably do a little bit longer expansion on at some point. Ways that a lot of us have learned the hard way over time, that if we had a do-over to replan our ideal facility, there's lots of little bits and pieces that we would do differently. And I love that comment about put bigger conduit than you think you need every time. Also
don't hide your irrigation lines. Don't put them in the ceiling or the walls. They need to be serviced.
Certainly not on the ground.
Yeah. I've only seen that a couple times. I had to work at one place that had it, so
Don't plug your. You guys got me started now. We're gonna have to have another episode for this. Don't plug your 240 fan into a 140 or 120 outlet.
It won't work,
very
right?
Not for long.
Yeah, or order 220, 240 lights if you have a 480 power supply. There's little things that, if you're looking to get into larger and larger scale cultivation, or, back in the day, Sid, I remember we had conversations about your spot, looking at, the power efficiency at different voltages. Mm-hmm. Take some time and read about that. Like there's a lot to understand there, and you can actually get, in a lot of cases, especially nowadays that, with LEDs and even the more modern HPS, like different products are more adaptable, and just learning about like, okay, if I invest X amount into a better power supply and panel, I might actually be able to use a lot of my same equipment and get higher efficiency, greater light output, et cetera. Or I definitely can't. And now we have some goals for next round of upgrades. I think between the three of us, if we could build a facility, the amount of 110, 120 volt outlets in there would be pretty minimal. Like, why? Because literally everything except the pressure washer and vacuum operates much better at 220, 240, or even 480 for that matter. If you have access.
How many iPhones do you need to plug into the room at that point? That's really all we are concerned with, because everything else is going to be running on a different power band.
Mm.
Depends what I'm doing with those iPhones.
Well, obviously, this is a conversation I think
European power block. Is that what you're talking about?
For quite a ways. I should probably start wrapping us up, though, as much as it sounds like we could go on for a good long time about this one. Maybe next week we can get into a little bit more of that facility planning talk. And, there's a few questions in here that go in to deal with that, talking about, things people would do differently. Should I put in a veg room? Should I plan to go immediately into flower? Would I build that extra veg room into my budget? Things like that, strategies have changed for a lot of people over the years. And it's worthwhile to go into a conversation about, how to plan out facilities, because there's a lot of people out there that are, still expanding and putting money into new facilities. And, if we can save you guys a couple of headaches by a few good suggestions, I think that's pretty worthwhile to me. All right. So to close out today, thanks Seth, Jason, our producer Chris as well for another great session. And thank you guys all for joining us today. Thanks for all the live questions. We got a ton of them in here. Sorry if we didn't get to you today. We will try to get you in on one of these next shows. To learn more about AROYA, please come book a demo at AROYA.io. We always welcome cultivation questions. Drop them in the link anytime at the AROYA app. Email us at sales@AROYA.io. DM us at Instagram or Facebook, LinkedIn. We want to hear from you guys. Specifically, if you guys have any good suggestions on long topics you'd like us to cover, throw them into the chat sometime or put them on our Instagram. We'd love to have a few suggestions on what you guys would like to hear from us. Well, thanks so much for coming, you guys. Smash that like button, leave us a review, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, wherever you listen to our podcast. We appreciate the feedback. Thanks, and we'll see you guys all at episode 132.